Hey guys, so it's Alex here, the Megas Aon Podcast. So with me today it's going to be Angela Elwell, and so a little background information on her. So she is a researcher in various subjects, including Christian mysticism, uh, Gnosticism, actually church history as well. But her main focus though is really on the mysteries involving Salome and the Mary Magdalene and many other female apostles. So how's it going today, Angela?
I'm all right. How are you doing?
I'm great. I'm so thankful that we are redoing this podcast because I know last time we had some issues there with the sounds and everything, but today I'm gonna make sure that we everything goes smoothly as much as possible. Okay.
Sounds great.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, I want to give the listeners a little more background information on you. So I know your main focus is on, of course, the female side of things when it comes to the apostles of Jesus Christ. But I'd like to know a little bit more about your story and how you became acquainted with the wisdom literature, the Bible, Gnosticism, or church history, Orthodoxy, all that good stuff. Like how'd you came about to go on this spiritual path?
Well, I actually think it's quite simple. Um, More or less, I felt that canonical literature was only telling me half of the story.
Hmm.
So I was looking for more information and quite easily started to find that there was quite a bit of information. I mean, that's really the gist of it. It was me wanting to know the full story.
Yes, and you don't really find that with many people involved in religion and even Christianity. People just they just follow the same the usual common type of religion. I mean, I'm not trying to knock common religion, but the whole usual story. But of course, all these tales and parables about Jesus, I think, are actually veiled wisdom. I think they're much deeper spiritual truths, in my opinion. But go on. I don't want to detract from your story.
Well, I mean, there's really not a whole lot to tell about getting into it. I mean,
Hmm.
yes, once I started to read this other literature, I started to understand a lot more. And I personally feel that a lot of people don't actually take the effort to seek a personal relationship with God, and that's why they don't seek outside of what they are taught in their congregation. But I did seek that, and to do so, I had to learn more information. And of course, anyone who studies any Gnostic ideas knows that once you begin, you don't stop. It's an ongoing process that will last you for many, many years. And enlightenment, I think, can actually be very helpful to increasing one's faith.
I think you, in our last conversation, when we were trying to do our recording of this, you mentioned that you were trying to get in a deeper relationship with Christ. Is that correct? That was like
Correct.
the starting point of your journey towards all this stuff?
That is the primary reason for me doing anything that I've done as far as research and knowledge.
Mhm. Now you're researching or have been researching for a while now the mysteries concerning the female apostles of Jesus Christ, right? So we have
Yes.
different personas. I mean, we have obviously Mary Magdalene, she's a big one, uh, but uh, but Salome, you don't really hear about though. So that's where I want to start off from there, and then maybe we can jump from there, look into other subjects. But who is Salome specifically?
Salome was a disciple of Christ. She was actually an inner disciple, according to some literature. People are not extremely aware of her because, as far as canonical literature goes, her name is only mentioned twice in a list of women in the Gospel of Mark. But we see that she is very prominent in other literature, such as the Gospel of Thomas, the Psalms of Thomas, Pistis Sophia, even writings from James. I mean, we can go on and on. She is very prominent. It's very clear to me from my understanding and learning that she was omitted from Matthew, Luke, and John because of the fact that she was very popular with heretical sects.
Mm-hmm.
And the church more or less seems to have airbrushed her from history and suppressed her, or perhaps you could say even spun her out of all recognition. And she's been conflated with other people in the Bible. There's other women named Salome, or who are said to be named Salome, because it was a popular name at the time. So people today really only know her by name. But if you actually look, you will find there's quite a bit of rich tradition there.
And doesn't she appear also in one of the non-canonical texts? I think it was the Gospel Egyptians, right? I think she thought they mentioned her.
That's actually a confusion. There's two Egyptian Gospels.
Oh, really?
Yes, the one you speak of is the Coptic Gospel of the Egyptians.
Mm-hmm.
The one where she is actually extremely prominent is called the Greek Gospel of the Egyptians. They're two separate texts from different time periods that people do get confused. But she's extremely prominent in that gospel, yes. Unfortunately, we only have a very small portion of it that we actually know what the context was, but very, very important in that gospel. Apparently, the Greek Gospel of the Egyptians was actually read in Egyptian Christian churches in the 2nd and 3rd century. Even in the second epistle of Clement, he actually even talks about this gospel and the information as if it was very well known at the time. But later, these ideas would be considered heretical by the church fathers, and the gospel was suppressed.
So when do you think this whitewashing of history involving the female apostles begins? I mean, do you think this starts around the 4th century, or what do you think? There's this kind of this, in feminist language, this patriarchal movement to erase these women, of course, including Salome. Like, when do you think that happens?
I believe that this was actually occurring in the 4th century, but I don't see it as something that is happening as strongly until about the 5th century. The 4th, 5th century is when we really see it taking hold. Prior to that, I mean, we have found frescoes and things that show paintings of women who were in authority and power within the church in the early days. And we had a movement away from that. But in the first couple hundred years of Christianity, at least some people accepted a woman in that place of authority. Although we do know from writings, particularly of Paul, that not everybody accepted that.
Yeah, and
so go ahead.
No, go ahead. Sorry, I don't want to interrupt what you're saying. Go ahead.
I think the idea of this sort of anti-feminist aspect here, I think this was something that happened early on, but it became more intense as time went on. And by the 5th century, we see that women are no longer in that position, period, except for in secret sex. But as far as mainstream, no longer. 4th, 5th century. And of course, this is the time when the canon comes into play and all these things. So it all works at the same time, really.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know in our previous conversations, you mentioned something about there were not only 12 male disciples or apostles, but also 12 female apostles. So I thought that was really interesting. Now, where do you see evidence of that exactly with the 12 apostles?
Well, first off,
Mm-hmm.
all 12, the women that are named, there are actually literature that names multiple women. The only two, Mary Magdalene and Salome, are the only ones specifically by name actually called disciples in literature, first off.
Mm-hmm.
The other women are called followers. I just want to make that clear because some people will debate, well, were they apostles or not? They probably were. However, we see in a writing that's attributed to Bartholomew, he lists all of the women in the garden outside of the tomb. Yes, other scripture talks about the women who went inside the tomb, but it talks about the other women who were there too. And altogether, we have 12 women. And we even have a sort of at one point we have 11, just like the whole when Judas left, and later we have a 12th. It's very interesting how it always aligns to the amount of men and women. It's always equal. I found that very fascinating. And some of these women are unknown today. I mean, their names are mentioned, but we know nothing of them. There's just not a tradition of who they were. So some of them we only know by them being named in different literature. Bartholomew, of course. We also hear some of the women named in the Manichaean Psalms book. There's also a Syrian fragment that speaks of the women. There's different sources. And it's unfortunate that so little of it survives. But yes, I don't think it was a coincidence that there happened to be an equal amount of women to men. I don't think that's a coincidence at all. I think that Jesus very intentionally probably did that.
Mm-hmm. Well, it does kind of make sense, though. I mean, there's these 12 apostles or these 12 correspondences between male and female, masculine, feminine, and that does connect to, of course, the bridal chamber, and that concept appears quite a bit in not only the Bible but also in Gnostic literature. You see that even in Eastern Orthodoxy, Greek Orthodox Church talks about it quite a bit. In the Valentinian circles when they were around. But can you speak a little bit more about the bridal chamber?
Yes, sure. Well, first off, I have to say that bridal chamber theology is pretty complex, but it does span quite many traditions. We see it in early Judaism, of course, in Christianity, Gnostic Christianity, even some in Tantra and Tibetan Buddhism. We see this idea. So this is something that was well known through many different cultures. This is not just one idea to one group, so it's quite important. But in most cases, it pretty much speaks to when the seeker finally awakens and becomes a single or unified one with divinity, but it's no longer unified within a mystery. This is actually complete realization. And I think that's very difficult for people to understand unless they're seeking this in the first place. Tradition speaks of that. Anytime you hear tradition speak of this, especially within a Christian context, it's always talked about as if this is a private thing that should only be spoken with people who already want to seek it. This is not something that you tell the greater public because they won't understand. But it's a very beautiful sort of enlightenment. And it really is about when two become one, a spiritual connection to the divine. And this can even be talked about within marriages. A man and a woman become married and become one unit. I mean, this is very much in the same idea, but it rejects all division. And we live in a time now where people are very divided, aren't they? So I personally think that bridal chamber theology is extremely important now, today, more than probably ever, to be honest.
Oh, I agree. I mean, you see this division with, the right and the left, or, Republican and Democrat and this sort of thing. And just in the ideology of people, especially when it comes to politics, it becomes even more. It's become very violent. I would say. I mean, I mean, you see people like Antifa, or you have all these neo-Nazis attacking each other. It's become very concerning, But
My
but
personal thoughts,
mm,
my
good.
personal thoughts on that is this is what happens. This is naturally what's going to happen when we increasingly live in a world that no longer seeks a relationship with God. It's inevitable when we come to that. And we live in a society that's becoming increasingly less concerned with these matters, at least in my opinion.
I agree because when you take uh, God out of the equation, we become our own God, right? And we're basically left to our own devices. So, but since we're left to our own devices, we actually become in that process human anti-human. I mean, I saw it in my own life. Like for a while, I didn't really believe in God, or I was just like totally opposed to that idea, or I was just trying to live my own life. But it came to a point where uh, you had to recognize that life in this world is just it's just a surface experience. Like there is a deeper mystery to it all. It's kind of like in the Matrix. When you take the red pill,
I understand the concept, yes.
and then you come to realize that yeah, that our world isn't the only world, that and we live in a very surfacey sort of society, and then everything's trying to keep you in that surface without wanting you to look deeper into things. So,
Well, you
and
know this, and I know this, and the listeners probably know this, but many people don't know this, and they don't think there is anything beyond this experience. And for me, that seems like a very miserable way to live, but that is their
mhm.
choice. It's not for me to tell people what they should do, but I just couldn't imagine living that way personally, having that sort of limitation, to be honest.
Yes, yes, and that seems very much a part of like the whole. I mean, like this Marxist sort of idea that we are our own God, that there is no God, and or that religion is the opiate of the masses, that sort of thing. So uh, I think in my perspective at least, I'm not trying to include you into it, but I think that's very much opposed to my how I view things, because everyone's because they're trying to make us more like dependent on the state rather than dependent on this deeper mystery, of life. We have the ineffable mystery, because in Gnosticism is all we're always trying to perfect ourselves, right? You know, it's all about being perfected, like
That is definitely a goal within Gnosticism, yes.
right. It's not like you have this idea of the atom catamon, or you have this idea of even like you look at Paul's epistles, it talks about being perfected. Like there are babes in Christ, and then there are the mature that consumes the meat, you know, so to speak, of the gospel. Then there's the babes who just drink the milk. So, in my opinion, I kind of view the gnosis as the meat, as opposed to, I mean, the belief in the faith is definitely a very strong part of it, but it's sort of like the milk, right? But belief and faith, in my opinion, is also, uh, I think, could almost be considered one the same as knowledge, because uh, because there is a being in Gnosticism by the name of Pistis Sophia. So
Yes.
she is very much set, uh, very much a strong figure in Gnosticism. Or and you see this in obviously the text Pistis Sophia. You see this in other texts like on the origin of the world. But Pistis Sophia means faith, right? Or something like
Faith and
that.
wisdom.
Faith,
Faith and
faith and
wisdom.
wisdom. Right. I'm
Yes.
drawing a blank here. And even, of course, the word philosophy means lover of wisdom. So
Yes.
definitely connects to that for sure. And then
Well,
the
I have to
idea.
say that
Mhm.
Sophia is a very complex subject, so I don't think in our talk today we could actually even scratch the surface on what the idea Sophia means.
Yes, yes. Sophia is one of these multifaceted figures that I could probably take like at least 8 volumes to really explain her significance in religion.
Yes, probably it would take a very long time indeed of discussions to really get at the meat of the whole idea.
Right, and Sophia, well, specifically in Gnosticism, she's one of these aeons that uh, exist in the Ogdoad. She
Yes,
or exists in the intermediate realm between the realm of the Hebdomad or the Zodiac, or what we call the realm of the Archons, the Demiurge, and we'll get to that
yes,
soon.
people give it different names depending on who you're speaking to, but yes.
hmm but she's also responsible for also giving birth to this abortion called the Demiurge. But I mean, there's different ways to kind of view that whole mythos, in my opinion. I mean, we don't really have to take that literally necessarily, but Sophia is definitely connected to different figures in the Christian tradition. You see the Theotokos, for example, in Orthodoxy. I think she's very much connected to her. Yeah, I mean, if you
Mother
read
to
like,
Mary. Mary,
yeah,
excuse me, Mary the mother, excuse me.
yes, yes,
Yeah,
yes, for sure. She's
uh,
good.
definitely. That is definitely something that is prominent with quite a few different Christians. And of course, there's also great argument about that as well.
Right. And then she's also connected to the figure of the Holy Spirit, right, as well, and because a lot of people, uh, well, I mean, the usual traditional viewpoint is that the Holy Spirit is male, but in early Christianity, though, I find that she's actually female, and even the church fathers admit to this. It's not just the Gnostics who are saying this. It's even you see
It,
people like,
this is something that is said by many people. I feel that uh, it's actually easier for people to get a better understanding of this concept if they have at least a basic understanding of the tree of life.
oh, like the
Uh,
Kabbalistic tree of life.
yes, I feel that if you have at least a basic understanding of that, it's easier to understand what we're talking about now. And I feel that a lot of people don't really have a very good grasp on it. That's just, my observation. But you really can see, because, within the tree of life, you see 10 divine configurations or emanations, and the persona is taken from such. So it really is helpful to understanding who is who, if that
hmm
makes sense. Uh, but it's extremely complex. It's probably even more complex than bridal chamber theology. So I can
hmm
understand a lot of people don't really access it very deeply because it takes so much time and effort to really, and you take it in small bits at a time. I don't know that a lot of people are willing to put that much effort into it. Uh, and then, then you have different forms of it. You also have Christ-centered Kabbalah uh, that was used as a conversion tool. But then even later, towards the 18th century, moving forward, you see the tree of life really being absorbed into mystical traditions. So there are actually different forms of what people think it means. But I think it's still helpful to have a broader understanding of who is who, including Sophia. I really do.
Right. And Sophia, she actually appears in the Old Testament as well quite a bit. I mean, she's in Proverbs especially.
Yes.
Uh, she's always calling people to listen to her and not to be stupid and simple. But people won't listen to her. That's a
I'm
problem.
pretty sure I'm pretty sure she's also prominent in Psalms quite a bit too. But yes, we do see Sophia or wisdom being talked about as a feminine principle or feminine figure quite frequently in the Old Testament. This is not something that is only a newer concept. No, this concept is quite ancient, and I think that it encompasses actually every culture I've ever come across. So it's obviously very important.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of people haven't really been exposed to that today. In the past, yes, but in today's world, I don't think many people are exposed to that idea. So when they hear it, it's new. And because it's new, perhaps it's shocking for them.
Mm-hmm. What I find interesting is that Sophia, or wisdom, is actually depicted as a demiurgical figure in Proverbs too, because it even says that she set up the earth, right? Like, or she was what the Lord was with her, or she was with the Lord, I should say, when He created the heavens and the earth. And I think that's how Gnostics also viewed Genesis, where like the Spirit of God hovered over the depths of the water and then created the manifest realm. And also connects to the Gospel of John prologue with the Logos, uh, shining light in the darkness or out of chaos, that sort of thing. And also Christ in I think it's Colossians. He's also depicted as, or he's called the wisdom of God. So obviously there's a deep connection between Christ and Sophia. And Christ and Sophia in Gnosticism specifically are aeons. They're part of a syzygy. I think I'm not pronouncing it correctly, but they basically they make up this bridal chamber, right? I mean, are they the one? Are they involved in the bridal chamber at all?
Some people would say yes, and some people would say no. I cannot say that we all agree on this. There are many Gnostics, particularly, who do agree with this, even mystics. Then there are also Gnostics and mystics who disagree with it, depends on their understanding. I think that it's particularly useful. This understanding is particularly useful for people who have who accept the idea of the Trinity. But I think that at the same time, people who would be modalist or binitarian may not agree with how that is being projected. So I think from a Trinity standpoint, yes, you can come to that conclusion.
And the Trinity is a very interesting topic too, because I see all these Christians still debating this even since the councils.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah. It's pretty nuts. So go ahead.
Well, I mean, I just mentioned, there's modalists, and these are people who think of God as one entity that has three forms, right?
Mm-hmm.
So an example, so people can understand what I'm saying, is think of water. It can be solid as ice. It can be liquid as in waters of the sea. And it can also be a gas, right?
Mm-hmm.
So for a modalist, they see Jesus as being Father, Son, and Spirit, depending on which mode he goes into. So of course, they may not accept the whole Christ and wisdom connection thing in that particular way. And then you have binitarians who, instead of three, it's two, more or less. It depends on who you talk to, though, because some binitarians would agree that Christ and wisdom or the Spirit are one, and then the Father is the other, right? But then other binitarians you talk to will say, no, the Father and the Mother are one entity, and then the Son is the second. So it just depends on who you talk to. So not everyone agrees. Of course, we've never agreed, have we? I mean, if you look at these ancient writings from particularly the 2nd century and forward, you see we today have the same arguments we were having then. We still don't agree on anything. And I think it's okay. I think it's good that we challenge one another, but we have to, I would just want to make sure that this concept is understood within some sects or groups, but not every Gnostic or every mystic agrees with the same things, right?
Yes, because even the first few centuries of Christianity has always been fraught by division. Is that constant again? It was never this unified monolithic vision that the Catholic Church likes to portray things, or they claim that that Peter founded the Catholic Church, but I kind of doubt that St. Peter even heard of a Catholic Church, to be honest with you. But, but that's a point of contention there. But I mean, but you have all these different groups claiming to be the true Christians, and you see that today still. So you have obviously the Roman Catholics, and you have later on with the Eastern Orthodox, and you have the Marcionites, and you had the Gnostics, obviously, and then the Ebionites, and all these sort of thing, and they each had their own interpretations of the Bible. Like, let's say the Old Testament should be followed, and others argue, like the Marcionites, that the Old Testament has nothing to do with Christianity whatsoever. or that Yahweh, Jehovah, is like a lesser deity, or is like an angel, and that there's like a higher unknown noble God Father that sent Christ, and he has nothing to do with the Old Testament, the Old Leaven. So you have these sort of arguments that people have been having for centuries, and they're still having arguments about it. So, I mean, it kind of goes back to the old saying of, one's man heresy is another man's orthodoxy, So I still think that's definitely true for now. It's been for ages, really.
I agree. Actually, if you look at the writings of second century philosopher Celsus, he speaks particularly on this division within early Christianity. He talks about people who proclaim they have the same God as the Jews, and then he talks about some others insist that there's another God that's higher than the Creator God and opposed to him, and then others who he actually says call themselves Gnostics and consider themselves different in their own ways and have different interpretations. And then there's others who want to live by the laws of the Jews, but they're still Christians, and how he considers it to be unorganized. It's the way that it comes across, right? And I think that leads into, us having a canon later on, because I really think with all of this going on that the Roman Empire considered Christianity to be a threat, and it sort of had to be organized, right? I think that's what it came down to.
Yes, particularly in the 4th century, that's when, while the church was trying to become more organized, at the same time they were actually trying to exclude other alternative forms of Christianity. You see that with the Theodosian Code, right? Like they were trying to take out different groups, especially like the Marcionites and the Manichaeans. But at the same time, they're also trying to get rid of all these pagan temples and statues and this sort of thing. So, and then when Constantine came around, that's when everything became much more complicated.
That's a good word. That's a good word for it. Complicated.
Yeah. It's by the time of the Byzantine era, I think that's when everything kind of went nuts, and then that's when the real true persecution of all these different lesser groups became much more prevalent, But Constantine, though, he's a definitely interesting character for sure, because it seems like he was also more of a pagan to me than he was Christian. I think he was more of a Apollo worshiper too. Because even the Roman Catholic Church is built on the 7 hills, right? The 7 hills of Rome, and then a lot of the churches in that area in Rome actually built on Mithraeums, So there's definitely a strong Roman pagan connection to Catholicism for sure.
I think it's interesting that so many actual cathedrals are actually built on top of what was formerly pagan holy sites and things of that nature. Is it a coincidence? Well, it's not for me to say, but you see, I mean, when you look at this literature from that time period, you see that there were many forms of Christianity that had a very pagan influence. And that still exists to this day. It really does. I mean, you see a Christian framework, but you see goddess worship and things of this nature. And people bicker and argue about what that means, but I see a lot of changes going throughout time because, we talk about Sophia wisdom. If you look at, again, going back to the tree of life, wisdom was originally Abba, the Father. It was a masculine principle. And we see that at some point in time, because originally it was wisdom was masculine and understanding that is next to wisdom was the feminine. But then you start seeing a feminine usage for actual wisdom itself, which equates to the same level as God. And I really think that you could see that when we were speaking of Mary the Mother, you can see that same sort of, you see that going on as well, this equal sort of idea. And we see that with Sophia as well. So I feel as though many Jewish ideas have been used but altered for different people's understanding of the divine. And you just continuously see it changing over time. It's actually quite fascinating to see the growth and the change, and even up to the modern day. Quite fascinating because, there was so many different ideas that we were talking about. I find it quite fascinating personally that so many of these groups actually rejected Jewish tradition and their writing, but they would actually usurp Jewish theology in order to explain their own means. To me, it's actually very ironic.
Yes, I mean, the Gnostics are often accused of being anti-Semitic, right? I mean, because a lot of these groups, some of them they're accused of, like, specifically Marcion, because he thought that Jehovah was like a false god, or the Old Testament was part of like the Old Leaven. But I mean, even Paul in 2 Corinthians, he says that that Moses, or the law of Moses, I should say, was the ministry of death, and he was actually trying to hide the truth or the glory of God from the Israelites. So I thought that was an interesting terminology there. So why would Paul say that? So we see people like Marcion, he kind of takes what Paul's saying and kind of runs with it. He goes to town. But
I have noticed that Paul's writings and Luke were quite important to his theology.
And getting back to this pagan influence on Christianity, I mean, you see this idea, of course, of the Son of God being born of virgin, and throughout many different religions. You see this with Zoroaster. You see this with I don't know if it's Christian or anything, but I definitely think it was Buddha somehow involved in that too. But
we see similarities also within the whole Isis, Osiris, and Horus. And that we see certain commonalities. I'm not saying it is the exact same. It's just we see similarities, and you spoke of some too. I think this is a virgin birth sort of idea is definitely not a new concept. And it even wasn't a new concept at that time.
Right.
This was sort of a holy thing. And people need to understand this is not like the first time anyone's ever heard that idea.
Mm-hmm. Well, Jesus was depicted as a demigod. He was born of a virgin. He was worshipped as a divine child by the Zoroastrian astrologers who offered him gold and incense, right? And then he was born during the winter solstice, and then on the very same date that Saturnalia and the Solus Invicti were observed in the Roman calendar. And then when Jesus was crucified, buried, and resurrected during the vernal equinox, so that's obvious connection there. And then you have the 12 disciples who's in accordance with the 12 zodiacal signs, and you have the 72 disciples in Luke that represents the 72 classical nations, and you have Jesus' ministry that lasted for like 3.5 years, which is 7 divided by 2. Then he turned water into wine. He walked on water. He raised the dead. He multiplied fish into loaves. He blessed in mud. He used to heal a blind man's eyes. He was supposed so-called prostitute, quote unquote, worshipped him with perfume, which is of course Mary Magdalene. And he taught his disciples to reenact mock human sacrifice in a way.
I have to interject for a moment.
Yeah. To the Eucharist.
Although Mary Magdalene is frequently thought to be the woman who anointed his feet,
mm-hmm.
Scripture doesn't actually name her as such. The woman who does that is actually unnamed.
Oh, really? Okay.
It's just that Mary comes into the story so close to there that people assume it was her. And there's a lot of division over whether Mary Magdalene and Mary of Bethany were the same person. Half of everybody will tell you, yes, they were. And the other half will tell you, no, they weren't. They were two separate people. So it's very difficult to actually have a conversation about it because people get very argumentative. Because being on the subject, for many people I have met and discussed with, Magdalene is frequently considered to be an avatar for Sophia. So of course we see worship going on in that way as well.
Mm-hmm. And where does this idea though that Mary Magdalene is being associated as a prostitute? Because I always find that that symbolism as being both degrading, but at the same time also honest in a way. Because when you see texts like Exegesis of the Soul, it talks about how the soul is fallen. Because anybody who is alive in this world is considered fallen, quote unquote, in Christian theology, right? Because anybody who lives in flesh and blood garments, they're pretty much subject to the whims of these world ruling powers, right? The principalities, I should say. So when you see texts like Exegesis of the Soul, it talks about how she was prostituted when she entered the realm of matter, but before that she was virginal, right? But she was a pre-existent soul.
Yes,
and,
I think that's where you get the division here,
mm-hmm.
at least as far as Mary is concerned, because people relate her to that character or to that being. However, you also have the other side, which claims that that's just conflation. So, it's really a difficult thing to really come to a conclusion without upsetting a different person. So I'm generally quite silent on what I think about it. However, I think that both sides have very clear arguments, and you believe what you want to and what you think is right. However, I don't think that I don't really think that we as human beings, I think that we can't really have a full grasp on what Sophia even means. So, really and truly, we have a certain understanding to a level, but you can never have a complete understanding. And I think that that's why there's so much arguing between different groups. Because as you probably know, Gnostics love to debate with one another.
Yeah.
All day long. I mean, read books, drink coffee, and debate. But the point is that there's so much that we experience. We even have experiences that we can't even put into words sometimes. And you have people arguing about what is historical, and then people arguing about what is a private revelation, and who do you listen to? And we don't know the entire mystery there. We only have a glimpse of it, and I think we try to do our best to make a sense.
Yes. Now, what's also interesting, what I wanted to also mention was this whole prostitute connection with Mary Magdalene.
Oh, yes.
Now, there's another figure in Christianity that's also considered a prostitute, quote unquote, and that is Helena, right? So Helen was the consort, or maybe even wife or girlfriend of Simon Magus. And now Simon Magus, he's a very fascinating figure that you see in Christianity. I mean, he's mentioned quite a bit in several Christian sources, but now how does he connect to your research? Like, where do you see him there?
I never specifically actually was researching Simon Magus. He only came up, him and his consort Helen, they came up because in my research of Salome, actually, there's a tradition that says that Simon Magus was infatuated with her. And it claims that it was because he was actually very interested in her healing powers, which she was very well known for. But it seems like Helen didn't necessarily believe that idea. So there's a little bit of perhaps a little jealousy there. It's hard to say if it was, but so, Helen herself seems to have actually, or at least her followers, seem to have actually preserved a little bit of Salome's history, especially her earlier life. So that's really where I came into actually starting to learn anything about Simon and Helen. Prior to that, I had the basic knowledge that most people do about him being, they say he was a charlatan and all this stuff. When you actually start to research him, no matter what you think of him, the man was quite brilliant. You have to at least give him that. The man was quite brilliant. And surprisingly, both him and Helen had a very, very strong following. And she was depicted as either Hera or Hestia in a way. She considered herself, and her followers considered her to actually be the avatar Sophia. And Simon would have been equated with Zeus, actually, and Christ as well. So it's really quite interesting ongoing there. And apparently, by the 4th century, when you hear the church fathers talking about him, they say there's very few of them left. There are very few followers of Simon and Helen that are left. But apparently at one time, they were everywhere. They were very prominent, but it sort of fizzled out, apparently, within a couple of centuries. But a very fascinating man. Very fascinating.
Yeah, if you read the Clementine homilies, he has a very long debate with Peter about the nature of the Bible and Christian and Jewish theology too. Just when you read their debating skills, it's really fascinating how they get into it. And they both
Speaking of Peter.
Yeah.
Speaking of Peter, part of the tradition says that Salome, on a regular basis, refused an audience with Simon because of his fallout with Peter and the other men.
Oh, really? Wow.
I suppose it was out of respect to them as disciples that she would refuse to actually give him an audience. So I thought that was interesting.
So it's interesting that Simon sought out her gifts of healing because he also, in Acts, also sought out the power of the Holy Spirit, right?
Yes.
From Peter, supposedly. And then Peter, of course, rebuked him and told him that, get away from me. You're stealing. You're committing blasphemy. Like get out of here. And then you're going to be judged for that. And then Simon sort of sulks away, and then you don't really hear from him again in the Bible. But when you look at the writings of the Church Fathers, you see a lot more information about him, and the way his followers describe Simon, is also very similar to Jesus too. By the way, I thought that was interesting.
Yes, that's why I briefly said that he is connected to Jesus, because there seems to be, from my understanding, apparently some of his followers actually thought he might have been Jesus too, or at least the spirit of Christ in some way. It's very difficult. I don't really have a great broad understanding, but some of them believed it was the same essence. And it's quite fascinating because at that time, there are people who are equating Christ and Zeus as the same entity in some ways. It's really quite complex because a lot of this we don't really know much about, because the Church Fathers did talk about things in some detail, but anything beyond that was destroyed or hidden. And so we don't really have a full idea of. I think it's important that we try to understand how people of that time understood these things, because we probably understand it totally differently than they would have 2,000 years ago.
Oh, yeah.
And I think it's important that we try to look at things the way that they would have. I think that helps us. I really do. But yes, Simon is definitely interesting, and you don't see him in canonical literature. But he had a very strong following, and it's very clear to me that Simon Magus was very much into magical arts.
Yeah.
And so I can see why he would be fascinated with Salome, because she was known to be a great healer, and her tradition of healing actually still survives into this day. So I could see why there would be that connection there, or he would want that connection. And I really feel as though he probably thought he should have been a disciple himself. Yeah?
Yeah, I did a lot of research on Simon years ago. It's been a while since I really researched the subject, but from what I remember, when you look at the Clementines, it said that he was a disciple of John the Baptist, and he was one of the 30 disciples, and that Helen was actually also one of these disciples as well, of John the Baptist group. Now, Jesus is also baptized by John, at least. He's not really called John's disciple necessarily, but he is definitely connected to John the Baptist. So I'm thinking that Simon and Jesus may not be the same character necessarily, but I think they're related. Perhaps they may even be brothers. I mean, I think that's definitely a possibility.
Yes, then, you're given the conclusion that the two of them are somehow intertwined. We're just not really sure exactly what that was. I mean, it's not really clear. What we have available still is not clear how, but somehow at least some of his followers seem to think that they were connected in some way. Was that on a conscious level, or was that on a more spiritual level? I can't really say. But that belief was definitely there, at least for some people.
Yes, and the whole idea of him being connected to Jesus, I mean, I think Irenaeus says that Jesus was actually an incarnation of Simon, according to the Simonians. So I thought that was interesting. And so, but Simon and Helen were definitely worshipped as royalty. From how I read things, they were kind of viewed as kind of like Zeus and Athena or Minerva.
Yes. Well, do you realize that at that time, Athena and Hera were both at different times considered to be an avatar of the concept of Sophia. We've had many different figures that equate with either wisdom or understanding, depending on who you talk to. Sometimes wisdom is female, and sometimes wisdom is male, and sometimes understanding is female, and sometimes understanding is male, depending on who you talk to. But it's related within this concept, the same as Sophia. So I'm not really surprised that Hera and to a degree Athena were actually related to Helen. And, it is said that Helen's followers believe that she was a reincarnation of Helen of Troy.
Yes, because she was very beautiful, and in Gnostic terminology, Helen of Troy represents the spirit, right? And that the Trojan army, or this Trojan War, also represents the battle of the archons over wisdom. They also want wisdom too.
Yes, I actually have read very similar things to that. So I think you've done your research in this area.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a while since I read all this stuff, but I do remember all, like, it's kind of tattooed in my brain. But yes, Simon was also very much a magician, and I think that's where I also want to go with this conversation. But before I do that, I do want to talk about this idea of the Bridal Chamber a little bit more in depth, so we kind of explore more, so for the audience to kind of know what it's really about. So I'm gonna quote a little bit from the Gospel of Philip, and it just says that no one can know when the husband and the wife have intercourse with one another except the two of them. Indeed, marriage in the world is a mystery for those who have taken a wife. If there is a hidden quality to the marriage of defilement, how much more is the undefiled marriage a true mystery? It is not fleshy, but pure. It belongs not to desire, but to the will. It belongs not to darkness or the night, but to the day and the light. If a marriage is open to the public, it has become prostitution, and the bride plays the harlot not only when she is impregnated by another man, but even if she slips out of her bedroom and is seen, let her show herself not to her father and her mother, and to the friend of the bridegroom and the sons of the bridegroom. These are permitted to enter every day into the bridal chamber, but let the others yearn just to listen to her voice and to enjoy her ointment, and let them feed from the crumbs that fall from the table like the dogs. Bridegrooms and the brides belong to the bridal chamber. No one shall be able to see the bridegroom with the bride unless he becomes such as one. So how do you interpret that?
Well, I interpret two aspects to it. First off, this is a private, again, it's a private experience. It's not something that is to be publicized, much less spoken about outside of people who can understand it. But also we see the idea of there being two types of marriages. We see a marriage of pollution and a spiritual pure marriage as well. And I think that it's trying to make this understood. This is not just a physical union, right? I think a lot of people today, when they think of being married, they think about physical union, right? But this speaks of the spirit. And I think that it speaks not only of, you have to look at the broader picture with the bridal chamber, because when you look at this, when the male and the female come together through marriage, we also see in other literature, Christian literature and Gnostic literature particularly, that it specifically is talking about when two become one, when the male and the female are no longer male or female. Now, this is very strong imagery, I mean, this is talking about a single unit, a single solid unit. There is no longer a division. There's no longer two. There is one. I think this is a concept that's difficult for many people because, and I think this is why many people have a hard time having the same sort of personal relationship with God, because the concept of being one seems to be lost on many people. And it's very much, to me, speaking about when the two become one, you are completely enraptured in the light. And it is a sense of perfection. And I think Jesus is very clear in some of the more Gnostic teachings of the Bridal Chamber that there is a perfection that comes from unity, oneness. And I think that's missed on a lot of people. At least that's part of my understanding of it.
Yes, and I think I made the analogy in our previous conversation that I see Christ as male, quote unquote, because he's spirit, because in that terminology, male is equated with spirit, while the soulish, the animal aspects of ourselves are considered female, quote unquote, right? So that's when those two enter into union. That's when the animal and soulish aspects of ourselves are transformed by the spirit. That's how I interpret it. With the pneumatic. Is that accurate?
No, that is an understanding within the Bridal Chamber. Yes, I particularly find this as far as a union of two people. Now, when we talk about it on a spiritual sense with Christ, he is the bridegroom, and then there is the hidden anointed bride. So, I mean, you can see the two aspects. But yes, what you're saying is definitely very much a part of the Bridal Chamber, yes. I mean, like I said, it is pretty complex, and it actually goes into quite a bit of depth. So the fortunate thing about it is that there's really no wrong way to perceive it, to be honest, because you have some people that think of it particularly as the entire reason for marriage is for that unity like God, right? And then you have other people who perceive it as seeing God in each other when you're together. And then you have other people who specifically see it as union with Christ, marriage to Christ. But they're all correct. They're all correct because they all speak to the same thing. They all speak of oneness. And that's really what it's about, union. It's all about union and not being a divider. I mean, since I study Salome, I can specifically say that saying 61 in the Gospel of Thomas has him specifically teaching her these aspects, and she exclaims to him that she is his disciple. I mean, it's interesting to me that the women seem to be the ones who were first taught this theology. To be honest, it shows up in Thomas and Philip, but it seems to be that the women were the ones who were first enlightened to this. And I perhaps think that may be because perhaps women are more likely or more easily or more quickly in life want to understand this actual concept. I think perhaps it's just perhaps men don't really want to understand this concept a little bit later in life. But this whole bridal chamber theology spans so many different groups that, of course you're going to have some differences. But I think that this is something that is sometimes difficult for people today because it is quite acceptable today for people to bed hop, and, there isn't as much of the idea of sacred union as there used to be. Would you not agree?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that's definitely accurate nowadays for sure.
I think I think it's something that's lost on a lot of people because they don't live with those sort of ideas. And I think if your heart looks for this, you will find that it's so beautiful. That's the thing with the bridal chamber. There is nothing negative. Wouldn't you agree? As far as bridal chamber theology goes, there is not one aspect that could be considered negative. Every bit of it is always very, very positive.
Sure.
And, unlike other teachings, some people take certain things as being negative. But not with bridal chamber. So I really recommend that people actually research it more. The Gospel of Philip is quite detailed. The Gospel of Thomas mentions the bridal chamber, I want to say 5 times. So it's in there fairly frequently. And you see it in other documents. So not only Christianity, but you even see it in the Vedas. I mean, you can look just about anywhere and find this information. And I really recommend that people who are interested in these deeper understandings check out the bridal chamber. I think that it will definitely be very helpful to people also in strengthening their faith.
Mm-hmm.
Now, whether that faith is in the Lord or whether that faith is in Gnosis is another story.
Yeah. But I think you can connect those two or bridge those two, I think.
Absolutely.
Sure.
Absolutely. I do absolutely think that.
Because, the idea of even like the concept of having a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, I mean, isn't that kind of Gnostic in a way? I mean, where you're trying to have this experiential relationship or experience with the divine, right? I mean,
Yes,
and Jesus is considered divine, but go ahead.
I don't think it's exclusive to the Gnostics. I mean, I really consider it to be more of a mystical experience. Not all mystics are necessarily Gnostics. That's why, but yes, I think that it's something that you see within the more mystical side of faith. As far as the Orthodox Church is concerned, we don't really talk much about the bride. I know the bride is mentioned twice in Revelations, the bridal chamber, the idea of it is very briefly discussed. But as far as Orthodoxy is concerned, we are the bride as the church.
Yeah.
It doesn't really go into a deeper, I think it actually does go deeper. I just think for most people, they don't take it any deeper. I think even Paul talked enough about it to know that it was a pretty deep concept and it was a pretty important thing. But I think most people stop there. They're like, okay, that's what it means. And I don't really concern myself with the details. And the details are important there because you can't have that union without being involved in those details, right?
For sure. I mean,
So I just think it's extremely important that anyone who considers themselves to love Christ needs to learn about the bridal chamber. If you love Christ, you must learn about the bridal chamber because it will transform you in so many ways. It's a very healing theology, very healing, I believe, very healing.
mm-hmm. Well, it is a mystical marriage in a way. So, I mean, when St. Paul in 1 Corinthians, he says that that the head of every man is Christ, and that the head of the woman is the husband, and that the head of Christ is God. And then I think also in 1 Corinthians, Paul, he says that that women should cover their heads, but men should be uncovered. I was like, but I think it's more of a parable to me. I don't think we should take that necessarily literal. I think it's more like a veiling of wisdom for me, anyway. I think that's sort of what Paul's talking about. Go ahead.
Paul seems to be some of the most misunderstood of all writings. And I've noticed that people argue, Paul's writings are argued about more than probably any other canonical writings, to be honest.
Sure. Yes. He says a lot of mystical things that I think can be taken very Gnostically. And then other times people try to take that Gnostic meaning out of it and kind of take a more Catholic approach to it. I mean, that's fine, but
Yes.
I mean, but like, if, for example, like First and Second Timothy, like they're obviously written by apostolic fathers, right? But I don't think they're really written by Paul, but I still feel like there's value to it. But I just don't think that is necessarily written by Paul. I mean, like the seven letters would be a little more genuine in my opinion. But other people think that they're all written by someone else, like Marcion or something. Like the radical Dutch theologians think that that's what's going on. That Paul is just a pseudonym for Marcion
Yeah.
or even Simon Magus. But
Well, New Testament scholars pretty much are in agreement that some of the later writings of Paul were not written by Paul.
right.
And if you actually look at the language closely, you can see why it would be debated. In many ways, I can see where Paul could maybe be considered to be quasi-Gnostic or a very conservative form of Gnosticism. I could definitely see where that idea comes from, and I think it can be supported by some types of Gnosticism. But at the same time, you have to remember there were also Gnostics who reviled Paul and his writings, even in the days of ancient. So he's always been a very controversial figure.
Mm-hmm.
Always.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And I think he will remain so for a very long time, I'm sure.
Yes, I mean it's unfortunate that people don't really seem to understand a lot of what Paul's saying, but you have to. I mean, the thing is with Christianity, you have to look at it with mystical eyes. You can't really view it like the pagans do. You know, that they see everything as just physical. You know, but you know, in Christianity, I think it's more important to view his literature or even the Gospels with spiritual, mystical eyes. You know, as opposed to just strictly physical or scientific, materialistic eyes. I mean, that's how I
would agree.
You know?
I would agree that with Gospels, that in a way you maybe have to interpret them sort of like you would a dream, right? There's a deeper spiritual side to it, emotional with your emotions, your heart, not with just logic. I think that it's important that we use logic in order to have understanding, but if you have all knowledge but lack heart, then you have no knowledge at all, actually. At least that's what I say.
Yeah.
I think it's very important that you have both equally. And I feel that sometimes can be problematic within the Gnostic community. I feel that some people get so concerned with the gnosis that they sometimes forget about the softer side.
Yeah.
Because everything becomes so mindful and analytical and completely of the mind. Yes, completely intellectual and of the mind. And we cannot forget the heart. We cannot forget the heart because it is central to everything that we actually believe.
Yeah.
For all of us, no matter if you're Orthodox or Gnostic or mystic or whatever you may adhere to or relate to, I think at the core, that really is what it's about. And I think that's why I don't subscribe to faith through or salvation through gnosis. However, I do believe that gnosis increases our faith and in turn does affect our salvation. But I think some people get lost on that they only think and they don't have heart or they don't use it. And I think that it's important that we do both. And if we use both, I think we become extremely enlightened because knowledge of the heart is also just as important as knowledge of the mind, correct?
I definitely agree with that. I mean, because there is something called the prayer of the heart, and that's also the same thing as the Jesus prayer, right? And in the Eastern Orthodox, especially when it comes to the Desert Fathers, and a lot of these, or the people involved in the Eastern Orthodox Church, they constantly chant this Jesus prayer, right? And the Jesus prayer just it kind of goes on to say, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner, or just say, Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me. But when you keep repeating it, supposedly you invoke mercy into your life, right? So you're calling upon Christ to intercede on your behalf. And also, when you look at the Rosary, with the Catholic Rosary, they're also praying to the Virgin Mary. So they're also calling upon the Virgin Mary to also intercede. But I also like to think of it, these methods of also connecting to also Sophia as well, I think, in a way. Because, but go ahead. What do you have to say?
Oh, I definitely am very clear that there is the feminine aspect of God.
Mm-hmm.
And I personally would equate that with the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
However, the problem, and we even bring up Bridal Chamber theology here again.
Mm-hmm.
Remember we were talking about the oneness, right?
Sure.
The union. Well, this is how you would think of God, right?
Mm-hmm.
If we are made in God's image, male and female, well, obviously those are attributes of God in some form. So you really think about that. And I find there's so many people that either reject the father and accept the mother, or reject the mother and accept the father.
Yeah.
But very rarely are you seeing people who accept both attributes. And you cannot only have divine feminine without divine masculine, or divine masculine without divine feminine.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's why I urge people to go to information within the Bridal Chamber, because it speaks of the equality. And I think that's a big problem I see, is that people are divided there. It's only one. Why can't both aspects be present at the same time? I think that's what's missing for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. It's kind of like the Jungian concept of like the anima and animus in a way. Yeah, the masculine and feminine aspects of the unconscious mind.
Yes.
Uh, but moving on though, I do want to get to the subject of magic and
Yes.
theurgy. Now you mentioned the Kabbalah, the Tree of Life, and I think that's interesting because I was also doing a little more research on the Kabbalistic cross, and I found that it's basically very similar to the Lord's Prayer, because you're also crossing yourself with that. You know how in Catholic and Orthodox circles you're crossing yourself, and you're also doing the Lord's Prayer. But in the Kabbalah, you're also doing sort of the same thing, because you're calling upon different aspects of the Tree of Life, like the path working, the Sephiroths, etc.
Yes. Well, there are 10 Sephiroths,
Mm-hmm.
and they all have a different configuration, more or less.
Yes.
They speak of, it's difficult to explain, but it does speak of, it can be thought of as emotions or understandings. There's understanding, there's wisdom, there's loving kindness, there's discipline, there's knowledge, and I think that I'm not particularly into the magical aspects of it as much as I am understanding sort of a hierarchy or an idea, right?
Mm-hmm.
I do know there is that aspect to it. And I feel that I'm not really the person to speak in great detail of that area, but I can give you some thoughts if you would like me to.
Sure. Well, before we get to that, I just also kind of want to clarify that, in the Lord's Prayer, it says, Our Father in heaven, hallowed be thy name, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. But I found that to be also very similar to the Kabbalistic cross as well, or the prayer before you do any sort of magical working, I guess. So
Oh yes, I definitely see the similarities there. Yes, definitely.
right, and then even there are like there's a grimoire in the Middle Ages that actually uses psalms
Yes,
to
yes, you're correct.
protect yourself from from the evil or or demonic influence if you're involved in magic, because when you're involved in magic, you definitely uh, things become much more surreal in my experience. But I mean, I have mixed
Yeah.
feelings when it comes to magic and theurgy and the occult, but I like to know more about your perspective, because after all, it's not really about me, it's really more about you. So, what are your feelings generally on magic and the occult and all these different secret societies like Freemasonry, the OTO, Golden Dawn, all that kind of stuff. So, go ahead.
Well, as far as secret societies go, I'm perfectly okay with them existing, and I understand that there is certain information that people want to preserve. And when I say preserve, if the greater public knows a certain amount of information, it's much more likely that this information becomes corrupted over time.
Hmm.
Whereas when you have it kept within a small group, it's less likely to be corrupted. I totally understand. And I'm
Hmm.
totally fine with there being different groups, these orders and sacred sort of groups. As far as the magic within itself, I am very much for healing magics.
Yeah.
Outside of that, I really can't say that I can find any reason to perform them that doesn't sound selfish.
Right.
Um, but I have I'm not against anything that's healing for other people, helpful
Hmm.
to others. But, there is a very dark side to Gnosis, isn't there?
Yeah.
And especially the Gnostic community. A lot of people, I think, ignore that, but there very much is that dark side there. But that's like that with anything. And
Hmm.
I think that a lot of people are afraid of the whole term of magic, period, because when you think of magic, for most people, generally, they think of people who are doing vicious things, wicked things, harmful to others, who are looking for glory and power, right?
Hmm.
Those people do exist, and I don't agree with them. But
Right.
people don't normally think about the people that actually want to love and heal. And those people, I think that the means or the ends to the means are justified. But generally speaking, I think that there are too many people who are involved in magical practices who do not understand what they're doing,
Yeah.
to be honest. Because this is something that you should study for years before you even practice the first thing. Years of study first. No, everyone just wants to jump into these things, don't they? They don't know what they're dealing with, and I think that it can lead to big trouble.
Hmm.
But that's their decision. So I really think that people need to be extremely cautious of magic. And I also feel that I've noticed an increase in people who want to connect with things on a spiritual level.
Hmm.
And I also caution people there because I see people who are not invoking the Holy Spirit or asking that they're not misled, right? I see so much of people just jumping into things without being prepared, and I think that it can be extremely dangerous. However, when it comes to these secret societies and things, a number of these societies actually do have experience. So, they probably would have a better understanding, and I can understand why they may do. I feel that it's even more if you're an individual doing this rather than doing a ceremonial magic as a group that's steeped in tradition,
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, I take more issues with it than I do against it. To be honest,
Hmm.
I feel that people need to be extremely careful with how they use this knowledge, and if you're not using it to help somebody, what is the point? Then it's selfish, really. If it's used for any other reason than to be helpful to another human being, then I don't really see why it is necessary. Because I personally don't feel that we need ritual to be devout in our faith for our connection to Christ. I mean, many of the disciples taught simplicity, you know. So am I against it? No, but I'm not for it. I'm not for it unless it's in a healing capacity. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. I mean, even the very act of exorcism is also could be considered sort of a magical act, you know.
Absolutely.
In the Gospels, you have, Jesus casting, demons from people. But then again, you have all these other things that happened in the Gospels and even in Acts. I mean, you have the apostles who actually cast lots to divine the replacement for Judas. You have,
This is, but see, the thing is that these are forms of healing and divination. These are things that are very light, that are helpful, right? And these are things, that's why I think that I'm okay with them, because we see these sort of things in Scripture frequently. However, when we come to the darker side of things, that's when, people who want to gain power and control and summoning and all that stuff, that's when I draw issues with it.
Oh, yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I keep reading, when I used to read this stuff, I haven't really researched this in a while, but people who have been involved in, grimoires and Solomonic magic, usually things turn out not to be so great,
You're right. You're right. And I've known my fair share of people who've involved themselves in this sort of thing, and there has been a price to pay. Let's put it that way. They've had a price. There is always a price to pay, right?
Right. I mean, you have to make sacrifices to all these different demons. So that's when it gets very problematic, in my opinion.
Well, if that's what someone wishes to do, you do what you will. Do what you will, in my eyes, but don't expect me to be standing next to you, right?
Yeah.
And I can accept that other people have different systems than my own. I respect it, but it doesn't mean I have to like it, right? I respect your choices, but it doesn't mean I have to like it. And but these individuals, I think, eventually come to understand what they are dealing with, but by then perhaps there's really not much they can do about it, right?
Well, what we can do, though, is I know that sounds cliche, but I mean there's the practice of devotional and contemplative prayer, which I do practice in my own personal life. So, but for you, I mean, I'm just kind of curious of what you would do on your own downtime. Like, is there any sort of spiritual practice yet you do, or what would you like to discuss for the audience out there?
I mean, do you mean as far as ritual and things of that nature?
Yeah, or anything that's sort of like considered like a practice, like a spiritual practice, anything like that. Do you go to church or anything?
I do. I don't go as often as I could because I sometimes find that I start disapproving of certain things that are being taught within churches I've been to.
Yeah.
And I've noticed an increase in, even in Orthodox churches, an increase of teachings being distorted. So that's not something I've been, I have noticed. Since I've noticed that, of course, I've been jumping around a little bit more from different places to really find my fit. But I do, in the Eucharist, I do substitute water instead of wine. And I know that is considered to be heresy, at least by the Catholic Church. But it is a practice that you do see some Gnostics. I know the Aquarians practiced it, and there are others as well who do the same thing. So it's not a new idea, but I'm very simplistic. However, I don't go through a lot of ritual or large speeches. No, I don't feel I need that. I don't feel I need that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't need to go on and on. And some people need that sort of ritual, but it's very simple, plain. I make my prayers. I do practice quietism, which I know is also considered heresy. So, I mean, but it's all a very, it's a large part of my experience could be considered solitary. I do believe in fellowship with others. I do very much so. It's just that as I said, I've had difficult times finding churches that I actually align with their teachings. They're either, I feel that I kind of fall in a place where I'm not Orthodox enough for the Orthodox, but I'm not Gnostic enough for the Gnostics.
I'm the same way.
And it's like, well, where do us proto-Gnostics fit in, right? Where do us mystics fit in, sort of thing? And I think that there's a lot of people, I've actually talked to enough people to think that a lot of people experience that. And, you bounce around, you try to find the right place for you, and it can be difficult. I generally find that people who are still very much a Christian, but it's a mystical Christian, you probably will find the most support from either liberal Catholic or liberal Protestant sects.
Yeah.
I also think the more conservative forms of Gnosticism would fit very well, because there are some forms of Gnosticism that are actually quite considered conservative compared to the other types that are actually close. They're fairly in line with a lot of what is Orthodoxy. I think those are options as well. Because I think that there's too many people who feel like their choices are one end of each spectrum instead of something a little bit more in the middle.
Yes. There are a few groups out there that are, I guess they could be considered conservative Gnostic. I mean, you have the Ecclesia Gnostica in California, or you have the Gnostic Sanctuary with Bishop Rosamund.
Yes.
And then I think there's another, I keep talking to you about her, but Amanda Radcliffe, and I actually did an interview with her last year, but I guess the audio got jumbled or scrambled by the archons of Skype, so hopefully it can redo that one at one point. But she's a Catholic priestess, but she doesn't really strike me as someone who's like a left-hand path sort of practitioner or occultist. I mean, but she does get accused of that though. But
I'm sure she does. I think people who accuse people in this capacity normally are actually really not aware of what they're teaching in the first place, and it's just, well, this is different than what I perceive, so I'm going to attack it. Like people do that all the time, don't they? They just attack it before they even investigate. It's very unfortunate, because I think that we shouldn't open our mouths until we've actually investigated something, because otherwise we look like fools. And but you see that quite frequently. And I know that a lot of people are disenfranchised with the Orthodox Church right now, not only just Catholicism, but also Protestant churches. There's a lot of dissatisfaction, and people are seeking deeper answers. Not everyone, but a noticeable portion. And that makes me very glad that people actually, something inside of certain people is telling them to have that personal relationship with God again, and for it to be more than just dogma. Instead of being religious, it's actually about spirituality. And I think that although there are different levels and different thoughts within Gnosticism, I think that this Gnostic movement that has been growing in many ways is very positive for people, as long as you don't let others dictate to you, because then you just get right back into what you were before, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I see that sometimes in Gnosticism, people who come into Gnostic thought, they let someone of a position of power tell them their ideas, and instead of making their own formulation, they just say, okay, this is my new dogma. And for me, that defeats the purpose. But I think that, like the lady you were talking about, the Cathar, I think that it's important that we have these people presenting this information. It must be preserved, to be honest. And we're finally at a point in time when we can speak of it without consequences, right?
Yeah. And of course, you do have people who are totally opposed to the idea of being or having female apostles or female priests, you have so I mean you see that all everywhere. I see on YouTube. I mean there are female priests out there, obviously, but as you just mentioned them, but there are of course people who are hate the very idea, because the apostolic church, like there's only male apostles. That's it. And
they're very strong about their opinion. They're very open about the opinion. I disagree with it. Of course, they don't care what I think. I'm a woman, right? I suppose that women would be taken more seriously if they were men and not told just to go see a hairdresser. There is definitely this underlying anti-feminism. Particularly, it seems to come from the Orthodox side of things. I really haven't seen that in Gnosticism. Within Gnosticism, I actually see women are actually greatly respected. So I can say that that's definitely a positive attribute. But you do see this, and I don't think that this is something that's going to go away, at least soon. But I think it's just our responsibility to challenge that. And, whenever you say anything that is new to people, you're going to have people. I've always thought that if people rebuke you, then what you're saying is probably true. Have you ever thought about that? People generally will always talk against things that are true. So usually when I see that, that means you're on the right track. That's my experience. Because if it wasn't true, people wouldn't care what you had to say. But they feel threatened by the truth. They do. It's much easier for people to live a lie than it is to live the truth. But it's nowhere near as satisfying.
Well, it's like the idea of throwing pearls before swine, right? Because they're trampled by dirty pigs. Not that the people who hate these ideas of dirty pigs, but there's that analogy there, though. So
I mean, this is what they know, and this is what they believe, and they're not willing to look outside of that. And I don't have any ill feelings to it, and I actually hope that one day they become more enlightened. But until that time, we just had to deal with these sort of naysayers, right?
Right. Yeah,
but
they're
women
pretty
have
much everywhere.
Traditionally not getting the respect that we've deserved in probably any area of life. But that has changed in recent years, or it has been changing over the last century or so. We have seen that, we have progressed there quite a bit. We still have work to do, and, it's going to happen. But, it's not just with women, because men who speak up in these ways are also chastised for it too, aren't they?
Oh, yeah. I mean, everyone's... Yeah.
There's certain people who do not want people to speak of certain things. They won't have it. They can't abide it. They can't hear it. And that's their shortcoming. It's not the person speaking this information. It's the person against it that actually is the one that is the problem.
I agree with that. I mean, you do find that in Protestant circles are very I just find in with them you don't really see this mystical aspect of Christianity. You do find them more prevalent in Catholicism and Orthodoxy, much and of course in Gnosticism too. But when it comes to Protestantism specifically, it's very much lacking, because
There
uh,
are mystical Protestants, actually.
mhm,
It just seems to be a very small sort of group of people. Uh, Most Protestants, you do see that lacking. They do exist,
yeah,
but it's just nowhere near the amount that you see within Catholicism and Gnosticism and other different forms. I really think part of the reason you don't see that so much with Protestants is a lot of Protestants who tend to be mystical or considered to be more liberal tend to be very independent in their faith, and a lot of them may not actually have a congregation that they go to on a regular basis. I think that's
mhm,
maybe why you see less of them. They are there, however, but you do make a point. It does seem to be less common to see.
mhm.
Why is that? Well, the Protestant movement has had a lot of changes throughout the years, hasn't it?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, there's so many Protestant sects that we can't
Like,
even list them all.
there may be even more than there are Gnostic sects.
Oh
I
yeah,
mean,
absolutely.
it's just, and see, the issue there is that I understand why the Protestant movement happened. I do. I feel that there's so many different teaching. That's the thing. Like, I've noticed that not everyone's teaching the same things, and so I don't really know that the term Protestant um, always encompasses everyone who says that they're Protestant, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Because different Protestant groups, there's a much larger, vast sort of there's a certain amount of dissension and division there with, this church teaches this specific thing and this church teaches this specific idea, but they may not teach a different idea that's within our theology. And I've also noticed within, uh, to some degree, within some Protestant groups, you see a promotion of sort of xenophobic ideas. Have you noticed this?
Yeah. I mean, you see this with there is a Zionist sort of movement in Christianity for sure. I mean, I guess you could call it a heresy if you want to be orthodox about it. But yeah, there's also this white nationalist movement in it as well. Um,
Well, I
you
mean,
know.
I see certain groups of people who are like, you don't belong to our church, so we have nothing to do with you. Is
Hmm.
really what it comes down to, right?
Yeah.
And I don't think that that's very healthy, and I don't really see that really doesn't align. For me, that doesn't align to what we're taught in the Gospels, right? Both the canonical and the Gnostic Gospels are very much about fellowship, aren't they?
Right. I mean, like in Galatians, it talks about how, the the free and the slave, the male and the female, the Greek and Jew, we're all one in Christ.
Yes, and
So,
that's why I really can't understand this division. Because to me, anyone who promotes division must not be one with Christ. That's my
well,
conclusion. Now, of course, I'm probably going to be barked at for saying that, right? But that's my opinion because that's the opposite of what we see him teaching us. Um,
well, in the Gospels, Jesus does say that he's come to bring a sword, not peace, but a sword or a divide. But I think we can interpret that, though, mystically as separating uh, spirit from matter, or at least, or transmute matter into spirit, at least. That's how I kind of view
no, I
Jesus
do
saying.
understand. I do understand it the way that you explained it, yes.
Yeah, I don't really see it as this Jesus as some sort of warlord, but in Revelation though he is depicted as a figure of judgment that enacts his
Yes,
judgment
I
against
mean,
the nations.
well, yes, I mean, he, with the concept of him being the king, does have that sort of warrior spirit to it.
Yeah.
But, we always see him as being very gentle. We do see him get annoyed occasionally, particularly in the Gospel of Mark. You do see him get annoyed occasionally, but you never ever actually see him angry. Always very gentle and very patient. So I don't know that he necessarily is warrior-like, but maybe that's an attribute of him that I just don't notice or see.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't
Well,
really feel that serves me, but we all have different opinions. Again, we all have different opinions, and I'm not trying to offend anybody by my opinions.
sure. Sure. Yeah, I'm definitely not trying to offend anybody here either. That's not really my purpose from doing any of these shows. So, this is like the first show in a long time since maybe 2017, really, that I've done a show. But I'd like to get back into it. So you are the first person that I interviewed in a while. So hopefully this show will be enlightening to people as much as it's been enlightening to me, especially in our discussion of sharing our wisdom.
So I do hope that people learn something today, or at least have confirmation of ideas.
Oh yeah, and I guess my final question for you is: do you have any? Are you working on any projects that you like to discuss or mention before we leave?
Yes, I will mention I am actually working on a novel. My book is actually very detailed and specific about the life and mystery teachings of Salome. I feel that it's really necessary to do this. I'm not really an author, to be honest. I'm much better at talking to people than I am at writing it down. But I feel it's necessary that I do this because the information is there. It's just spread out so far that it's very difficult to come by. It takes a very long time. So I wanted to put it all into one place for people. And when it's complete, it's a slow process, but when it's complete, I hope that people will actually be interested to learn about this very hidden and very important figure, more than people realize.
Then that figure is Salome, right?
Yes,
Okay.
Salome. She is much more important than people ever realized.
Okay. Now, what's the name of the book? Can you tell us that, or is that still working? Are you still working on it?
I have a working title at the moment. I probably will change it, but
Okay.
so I don't need to announce that, but it'll definitely be catchy. Don't worry about that.
Ooh. So when do you think it'll come out?
I would like to have it completed by the end of the year, and I think I can reasonably actually have that done by then.
Yeah.
So perhaps the following year, I think 2020 would be a good time to expect it ready.
Ooh. I can't wait to read it because I am myself working on a book. It's called The Sunlady Unveiled, and that also connects to the divine feminine, which I'm more interested in pursuing now
Oh yeah.
than I have before. Before I didn't really care too much about that subject, but for some reason, Revelation 12 caught my attention because I think around 2017 there was all this hoopla about some event that would happen on September 23rd or something. I don't know if you've heard of
Yeah.
that, but there's all these people theorizing that the rapture might happen that day. Obviously, that didn't happen. Um, I don't think, honestly, I don't even think it ever will, really. It's just, I think people keep expecting the rapture to happen in their lifetime. But I mean, I don't know. I don't really know for
Well,
sure.
to be quite honest, if you actually get into, I'm not going to get into it with you today,
Hmm.
but if you actually look into the rapture and the theology there, you will find that there is so much information, and this is a subject that you think people argue about the divine feminine. No, no,
Yeah.
no, no, no. The rapture is something that every group from every different type of Christian belief system has to put their input and talk about arguments. No one agrees with each other. And, people tell us so frequently that this is the day that you start getting desensitized to it, don't you?
Yeah. I mean, you have
You
the pre-trib, you have post-trib, you have mid-trib. I mean,
know,
everyone has their opinion, but what really is
uh,
truth?
I do, off the top of my head, I wanted to mention, since you mentioned
Hmm.
Revelation, the bridal chamber and the bride, sort of the theory, is mentioned twice in there, both in chapter 19 and chapter 22, just for
Mm.
people who want to look at it from a piece of canonical literature.
Are you referring to the New Jerusalem? Was that what we're referring to? Or the...
Well, it depends on who you ask.
Ooh.
Everybody has different opinions, right? Uh,
Hmm.
chapter 19 is the reference to the marriage of the Lamb and to his wife that has made herself ready. And then in chapter 22, it talks about the Spirit and the bride saying, "Come for anyone who hears," and that, the water of life is free of charge, take it, that sort of thing. But it is
Hmm.
mentioned twice in there, and specifically speaking of the bride, and the bride is spoken in this context. You could take it as being an individual, although it could be taken as the church too. I guess, again, it really, and you were talking about New Jerusalem, we see that idea there also, but everybody has a different idea. And then we have people who specifically talk about Jesus and did he have an anointed bride during his ministry? We have these multiple ideas, and everyone knows that their idea is correct, right?
Yeah.
So, uh, and that's, see, that, again, so I'm not going to say what it means because it means different things to different people.
Yeah.
I want people to read it themselves, and then they find their meaning out of it.
Yeah. And I do find also the figure of the woman clothed with the sun also connects to what we're just discussing. We have
Yes,
the Holy
yes, for
Spirit,
sure.
Sophia, Helen, Mary Magdalene, even connects to Isis, Ishtar. It's pretty amazing.
Hestia,
Yes,
I mean, I can just
Minerva,
keep going on. We could even
Juno.
say Diana. I mean, uh, the list goes on and on. There's many, many women from many, or feminine concepts with different names from different cultures uh, that align with the idea of Sophia. It just depends on where in the world you are, what name is given.
Right, right.
I think that's why some people use the term seat of knowledge, because it is she who is known by many names. For a lot of Christians, that is Mary the Mother.
Hmm.
But for other people, it could be Sophia, or it can be any female figure that they recognize or see a divine feminine presence within, or an avatar of. I mean, that's why, of course, you're not going to have everyone agreeing, because it's such a broad perspective. Um, it really is. I mean, again, we've only just barely grazed the tip of the iceberg on the subject of Sophia, and I think we've actually said quite a lot about it.
Hmm.
But there's still so much that we haven't said or hasn't been spoken,
Yeah.
right?
Yes, and one thing I do want to add, I mean, there's so much to say about the subject, but in the text, the Thunder Perfect Mind, also Sophia connects herself with both the bride and the bridegroom. So I thought that was interesting. So,
Yes.
so she's both of those figures. So I'm like, I won't. But you have to look at, again, you have to look at this more mystically than with your physical eyes,
Well, I
just
think
because.
you can find answers to to what you just spoke about if you actually look into the Bridal Chamber.
Yeah, because they both become one, right?
Yes, I think you can find a lot of information there. That's why I really recommend that people learn about this theology, which is very ancient, and it will explain so much of the questions you have that we
Yeah.
have. Actually.
Yes. I mean, we can go on and on about this subject. I mean, it would probably take us at least a month to really kind of dig deep to really
Yeah,
understand.
you're correct. You're right. It would
Well,
take
if
probably
we
about a month of weekly
like
programs to just get the basics, the basic parts done.
right, and like I mean, it'll probably take us 10 hours a day just to kind of go through each of these texts to kind of look at all the different aspects of it. But we don't really have the time for that because you know we have lives, but outside of this, but
We all have our lives to get back to, but whenever we can, we find the time for the knowledge and the understanding.
absolutely, amen to that. But yeah, I want to thank you for joining me with the discussion. I really do appreciate you taking the time to talk with me on this, and I hope people get a little bit more wisdom in their day by listening to this. So thank you so much, Angela.
And thank you for having me here today.
All right, thank you so much. All right, God bless.
Bye bye.